Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, in my case, the Yugambeh, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The Women in Work Parliamentary Friendship Group is a very important one. Its aim is to facilitate apolitical discussion and promotion of gender issues in public policy and draw on the experience and opinion of women. Parliamentary Friendship Group has a focus on women's economic security, relying on economic security for women and its member organisations to raise awareness of the many issues facing women today in terms of economic security. So now we'd like to hear from our next guest speaker, Bianca Hartge. Did I get it right? No, sorry.
No, doesn't matter. Bianca Hartge-Hazelman.
Hartge-Hazelman. Bianca, great to hear from you. We'd like you to now present your presentation from Financi Women's Index.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be presenting this to this group, and I'm hoping to be able to do that a lot more in the future. I've been authoring the Financi Women's Index for 3 years now. It's now modelled by, I work with Deloitte Access Economics to create it every quarter. It's reviewed by the Australian Bureau of Statistics every quarter because I use a lot of their data. I have a number of economists that I work with that are part of the board, and just about to add the Grattan Institute to that too, which is very exciting. These are people, including myself, that are passionate about change on economic equality in this country. So we are the only place that is measuring and tracking financial progress of women and in terms of a score and the time frame to economic equality on a quarterly basis in this country. So I'll show you what the Financi Women's Index is in the hope of showing you what we've found throughout COVID, and I'm going to discuss some of the challenges and new strategies that you could potentially look at. I'm big on that we do need change, that we need a mindset change, a DNA change in Australian culture that comes with setting actual new neuro pathways. And our language is key to that in terms of being more positive language rather than the defensive language that is getting on people's nerves. So there's a scientific solution there that I'm proposing. The Financi Women's Index was created and launched in 2017 on International Women's Day to try and make sense of all the data that's coming through on the gender pay gap, on the superannuation gap, on leadership gaps and things like that in the workplace, on education gaps, on unpaid work gaps. All of this data that gives you a mental overload. Now, I, prior to starting this, was a full-time journalist at the Australian Financial Review for many years. I've interviewed Stephen many times before, and I just found myself frustrated at the paper, which I still love very much today, that paper, but frustrated that I couldn't do more reporting on women's issues, which were just coming front and centre all the time to me. And I became a mum, and then they were becoming amplified. I've now got 3 daughters, so I feel it's something that I'm obsessed about and I write about on a daily basis for women, and I will continue to do so until I'm not on this planet. So basically the Women's Index looks at education, paid work, unpaid work, pay outcomes, the gender pay gap, leadership and wealth through superannuation. We're putting all that together into a score just to make it digestible. And if I go back to that previous screen, and I just remind people of this, that if you aren't measuring it, you can't manage it, you can't fix it. That's a famous quote from Michael Bloomberg on perhaps why he started Bloomberg and tracking and all the different measures for doing that through Bloomberg. So what does it look like, economic equality in Australia? Well, without a doubt, what we've found is that for every month of COVID, if we start at March and we look just at the June quarter, so there's 3 months there, for every month, it has added 1 year, 1 year's delay to that time frame to achieving economic equality. We look at these measurements. So you've got unpaid work on your screen, the participation rate, the underemployment rate, employment, those full-time numbers, gender pay gap, super, ASX number of women on ASX top 200 boards. These are years to achieving parity here when we look at these numbers of men relative to women. So it's blown out to 36 years. So we say 36 years to achieving economic equality because we're taking the one with the longest time frame. And that's if the constant rate of progress continues, and it has been improving in recent quarters. It absolutely has been. And then we hit COVID, and suddenly we've got to a point where the initial impact of COVID hit women hardest. And even though we've seen a recovery somewhat in those employment numbers, I'll draw your attention to something that hasn't changed. It's going to make it a lot harder for women to move forward and to lift that participation. So 36 years till we see economic equality in this country based on employment numbers, and that's 3 to 4 years added to the time frame because of COVID just at the start of this year. So the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be to achieve economic equality in this country. We need it from an economic point of view. I think the financial impacts, Grattan's done a lot of work on this, McKinsey's done a lot of work on this, on the economic benefits. Unfortunately, we don't value unpaid work in this country, so women feel undervalued. And if we were valuing that, we could actually put that in GDP figures and see probably a bigger number for us if we started to do that. That's another discussion. So this is what the index looks like. If you can see the green line has been ticking up as we're moving closer to parity, that economic equality score. Now, we had progress for women in the June quarter, and you might say, well, how was that, given that COVID hit women's joblessness more so than men? It actually hit, the initial impact was harder on wages for women than it was men. We saw a slight pullback in the gender pay gap at the start of the year. So why was that? Now, what we had, I'm jumping forward here, is the biggest thing that I saw was that the gender gap in the underemployment rate, women's underemployment has always been about double that of men's. And that's the number of women who, basically, I'm summarizing here, want to work, have the capacity to work, but for whatever reason, they are unable to work at the ultimate capacity. So where they are unable to realize their full potential. What's happening here with COVID is we've got more men in that boat. So the gap between women and men has narrowed, giving the illusion that women have actually progressed because outcomes for men have become that much worse, as we've seen unfold in the September quarter ABS data for men in particular. So this has created this sense that, women have progressed in the June quarter financially because a gender gap has narrowed, but we're progressing at the expense of men in some point of view, which isn't the way we want to achieve economic progress and equality in this country. And I expect this spike, and I know Stephen could add to this, will probably unravel. We tend to see these spikes in indexes, and we probably will see this one start to unravel. So the biggest thing that for me, in addition, if we look at paid work, is that COVID has reversed 2 years of full-time employment growth for women. Women's full-time work participation has been outpacing men for decades. And we have seen men's part-time work participation outpace women. So there's been a structural shift. There's potentially been this family shift on caring responsibilities, more flexible work has come into play. These things have been happening. They've been very real. But because of COVID, we're now back in time 2 years. My look at the latest numbers, we're back in time. We've made up some ground. We're back in time about 18 months for women in terms of those full-time employment numbers. So less women are participating in full-time work. Even though we've had a recovery and women have started to, when Stephen showed that last graph, we've got more men experiencing joblessness. The number of full-time to male full-time employment numbers, men are still only down about a year's worth of, they're back in time about a year in terms of those full-time employment numbers. Women are still back. We've still got a hell of a lot more ground to make up. And the problem with this is if we're going to lift economic growth, if we're going to achieve economic equality, if we're going to further support women into the workforce and realize this unrealized potential, we have to make up a lot of lost ground because of COVID. And this is a problematic for the Australian story of achieving economic equality. The biggest barriers that I see where gender gaps are likely to worsen because of COVID are in unpaid work. This is, I've made a chart out of a survey that was conducted by the Melbourne University. A couple of professors did that. Now, the Hilda survey data comes in as part of one of the feeding sources of information on unpaid work for the Financi Women's Index. But because that data is lagging, we will see that out in hopefully this September or December quarter. I've looked at, well, what is smaller sample data showing us? And it's showing us that the volume of men are now doing more unpaid work at the same level as women were before COVID. So that's a good thing, you might say, but women are doing far more unpaid work beyond what they were doing, far beyond what they were doing before COVID, across all activities. So that's paid work, housework, primary care activities, and those supervisory activities. So our ability to participate in the working economy is being hampered by the burden of unpaid work, is being further obstructed by childcare system that is not like the education system that is free. We need to learn from what we saw early in COVID and the release that gave many women in being able to participate, and potentially that improvement, that recovery story that we have seen, and ask ourselves, did that free childcare have a role to play? And I suspect we might find out that it did. So there's a few barriers that are really affecting women, and unpaid work and childcare is a huge one if we are to address this 2-year lag gap that we are now in with women in work participation. Just another thing where I expect gender gaps could worsen is in superannuation, and that is dependent on the longer this goes on, this story, for women not participating in the workforce as much, because that impacts wages, that impacts your ability to earn super. So Australian Super provides their membership data to the Financi Women's Index every 6 months. The latest round of data showed that the gender gap for their membership, which is Australia's biggest superannuation fund, has actually widened. That's a problem. So we've had over this period the ability to access your super more, although I know Treasury figures are showing that more men have accessed their super early than women. But at the same time, you've got less women in the paid workforce. So it's creating this situation where this gender gap story is widening, which is going to create bigger problems for us down the line if we don't have measures in place to start helping people rebuild their superannuation. So there are real, as Stephen said, real economic consequences to what is going on, real progress concerns that I have to what is going on. The things that I feel that will really start to address what has been happening. There are 5 simple things that I see that, yes, might sound simple, I know are harder to achieve, but they are really programs in schools. We need to change attitudes and mindsets when it comes to gender. That is something that needs to change. We need to look at when children are most exposed to these gender stereotypes that's been set in our DNA in many ways, that sees women potentially seeing themselves as lesser than men, or potentially not aware of the issues that are happening until they have children. So we need to empower and educate both genders on what those are so we can bridge that knowledge gap there. And I believe that should be happening in schools. So there's campaigns of awareness also that need to happen around, for example, domestic violence is a big one, particularly at the moment. We've got a rise of that as a result of COVID, which is just absolutely devastating. The campaigns that I see around gender are just as important in valuing and respecting each other from a positive point of view. And also, when we think about things like domestic violence, that has a profound impact on the economic security of women, and not just domestic violence, financial abuse as well. But it also creates, the whole story around that creates an unfortunate perception that tarnishes men. That tarnishes men that don't actually do this. And I was thinking about this. I actually whacked myself with a ladder. Not a ladder, a rake in the garden yesterday when I was with my mother. And she made the odd comment to me, someone's going to think your husband whacked you in the face. And I thought that's a horrible thing for men, for our society to assume if there is a woman hurt, to think that, well, there's so many women that unfortunately 1 woman a week dies because of domestic violence. We have an obligation to men as well to start changing the conversation here, not just for the safety and security of women and future generations, but also to celebrate men who are actually doing who are actually respectable to women as a nation as well. So there's a need to change campaigns of awareness on many fronts there that impact the economic security for women. policy change, without a doubt, will affect all those. Leading by example, we need that at a government level and a business level. And as I've just alluded to, celebrating the success stories. These are 5 things that I see as absolutely critical to achieving economic equality in this country and strengthening economic security for women.